In this exercise we are going to make a simple accessory or attachment using the attachment tool of the toolkit. So as always we need to start from a clean scene, so reset everything. So File, New, General. This will reset the scene to the defaults. Don't save. Make sure the cube is deselected, so select none, and then what we can do is access the toolkit from the sidebar, so View, Sidebar. There's the sidebar and there's the toolkit tab, so click on that and we should have a list of tools that are available in the toolkit. So Room Tool, Furniture, Attachment, this is the one that we're going to use, Clothing, Animation, Export. And we'll get a version number indicating the version of the toolkit. So what we want to do here is click on the Attachment tool and then click on Append Attachment File. This will drop in the avatar or representation of it and a series of bones, and those represent the avatar's bones to which our attachment is going to be made. So in this case all we're going to do is make a simple headband and attach it to the head bone that's hiding inside the avatar's head. So let's just hide that for the moment so that we can see it, just for clarity. So there is the head bone. Let's hide the head. There's the head bone that we're going to use. So before we actually start, what we want to do is set the bone that is going to be used for our attachment. So for that we can either click on the box or we can use the eyedropper. So click on the box, it'll give us a list, and in this case we want head. So just click on that to set that as the bone that we're going to use, and then all we do is drop in our basic shape. So add mesh, and let's go with cylinder for this. Cylinder, so add mesh cylinder. That'll drop a cylinder at the avatar's feet because that's where the cursor is by default. What we want to do is just go into Add Cylinder, the overlay, open that, so click on the heading, and we just want to reduce the number of vertices. So let's go with, let's try 12. That reduces the complexity of the curve in this case. Size is okay, and in this instance what we want to do is disable cap fill because we're going to make a headband, so nothing. That'll remove it, and that's all we need. It'll generate UVs for us. We might adjust those later, but we'll see. So that's our object. We're going to move it now. So move, rotate and scale, or we can use the universal that combines all of them. So these are our widgets, and what we'll see is a different coloured widget when we activate these. So that's the move, that's the rotate, that's the scale, and that's the universal. What we're going to do is just click, grab, hold on the arrows and drag this into position, and I'm going to do some basic editing. Make sure the mesh is selected, so click, edit mode, object, edit mode, and as this is going to be a headband, we want to reduce the size of this. We could do this in object mode, but in edit mode we have a bit more control over this. So we want to select this loop of edges, this edge loop around the top here, and bring it down to about here. So for that, what we want to do is press the Alt key and then click one of these edges. That will select the loop, and we can see that let's just go into wireframe to make that easier to see. So it's highlighted just that loop around the top. In edit mode, we've got the same widget tools. So move, rotate, scale, universal. I'm just going to move that, click, drag, shrink it down. Same again, Alt click, Alt click, and then what we can do next, change our selection mode to faces, and we'll do the same thing again, Alt click, but if we click on one of these vertical edges, what it'll do is it'll select the entire loop around the mesh. So we're selecting a face loop. So we've selected that, switch to scale. What we can do is scale universally, or in this case we want to scale on 2 axes. All we need to do is scale it front to back, left to right. So we're grabbing the green handle, rescaling, red handle, rescaling, use move to reposition, make some adjustments, we can use rotate, and then we'll position this so that we get a simple headband. That'll do. So that's what we've got. Exit edit mode. So edit mode, back into object mode. Object menu, shade smooth. And what this will do is remove these hard lines, these facets that we can see on our mesh. Object, shade smooth. So it now looks like a continuous mesh. So obviously we've got some clipping. We don't need to worry about those for the moment because this is just a simple exercise on using the toolkit to make the attachments. So that's our basic mesh. We need to now assign a material. So make sure our mesh is selected. Material properties. There is no material available, so we can do one of two things. We can either click the plus sign, that will create an instance that will appear here, or we can click new and that will create an instance and populate it with some material properties. So click that, got our material, rename, so click type, headband, space, square brackets, 0, close square brackets. That is our IMVU compatible material name. That's the preview. We can change the color, and then this will just give us a quick indication of the material that we could apply to our object. So that's the basics. To complete the material, we need to shift into shading workspace. So shading workspace, let's view our object. There's our object. We need to add an image texture node. So add texture, image texture. This will drop in a node. Click to confirm, then link, click, drag, color output to base color input. That will go black because there's no material or image associated with the object yet. So for that we want to click on new. Let's call this headband. So click type. Width, we want this wider than it is longer or higher, obviously because we've got a very thin band that will map to something like that. So it'll be a really thin shape. So maximum is 512 by 256, but for this is the height, so let's try 128. and the width, let's go with 512. So click type, change generated type, color grid, and then OK, and we get our object textured with the image that we've just created. This is a generated image. So let's take a look at the UV map. So that's the basics for our material. So for the UV map, we want to go into UV editing. So that's the UV map. The object is already automatically set up for editing. So let's just focus on our object to make this easy to manipulate the scene, because it's a bit wayward at the moment. So for that, view, frame selected. What this will do is shift the object to the center of the screen so that we rotate around it. And we're in solid mode at the moment, so we want to shift or switch to textured preview. So given the shape of our object, it's very thin versus it's being very long. So what that means is the UVs are stretched. So what we can probably do is half this image. Now, because we've already created the image, what we can do for that is access sidebar in the UV editor. That will bring up the pop-up, and we can see that we have some image data, so we can access the X and Y coordinates of the source file. And what we want to do is change Y to 64. Let's half that. That'll update on the mesh, which will give us a default mapping that we can use. Now, if this wasn't automatically unwrapped, what we would need to do, switch to Edge Select in the 3D view, select the edge at the back, and then from the Edge menu, mark a seam. So Edge, mark seam. That places a seam, which then means that when we select the entire mesh, so select all, we need to unwrap. So UV menu, we can do this in the 3D view or in the UV editor. Either or does the same thing. So UV, unwrap, and that will create a UV of our object, which we then would need to edit relative to the appearance of our object. And its orientation will be a bit wonky sometimes, but again, as with all the other editors, we have our widgets and manipulation tools that allow us to select our UVs and manipulate them into position. So we can hold Control and snap to the grid, so when we rotate we're snapping to increments. Let's move this, see where the letter is. So that's where the letter A is. So move this down into the bottom corner. And what we can also do, UV, snap to pixels, corner. So UV, snap to pixels, corner. And this will use the pixels of the image as a micro grid, which keeps everything uniform. So as this is a regular sized object, what we can do to scale this uniformly is lock the cursor, so that's this thing, down into the bottom corner. So we want view, change the coordinates, so click type 0, 0. The cursor's drop down to this corner. We then want to change the pivot point to the cursor. That snaps the widget to the cursor's position. What we can then do, scale, click drag, and we can scale our selection. So hold Control to snap to the grid. Let's scale our object and keep it snapped to increments. So based on this, we could decrease the size of the image even more. So image tab, change that to 32. Make some adjustments. So click drag the green handle. So that's our UV map. It can take a little bit of fiddling, but for simple objects like this, it's relatively straightforward. We can use the default that's provided by Blender when we drop these objects into place, but the likelihood is that we would actually need to update and edit the UV map. And for that, we're using the seams and then manually unwrapping our object and then editing the UVs to fit the shape of the texture so that we're using as much texture space as possible without stretching. So that's our object. Next step, go back into layout. That's the main view. So there's our object. Now we're going to use the tool, and this is where setting the bone comes into play. Because what we're going to do is select the mesh and then click Set Up Mesh button. So click that. The toolkit will do the thing that's needed, which is to add the actual attachment armature to the project, and it'll link the mesh to that. So if we just hide the head, so we've got attachment rig, that's what we need, and the default is head. That's the one that we use to position our object relative to the avatar. So if we hide that, and we can check our objects associated correctly with the armature by selecting attachment rig. So make sure it's always attachment rig, not head. Object mode, switch to pose mode. And then what we can do is toggle, so click between the two bones that are part of that armature, press the R key, R for rotate, and we can check whether our object moves with the armature. If it does, it means we're set up correctly and we can export. So that test checks out. Incidentally, if we accidentally set the position of a bone like so, and we want to reset it, all we need to do is select all, go into the pose menu, then clear, transform all, and this will reset the bones back to their defaults. We want to make sure that that's the case before we export. So back into object mode, unhide the bits that we've hidden, and then all we need to do is save the file. So file, save as, browse to our file location where we want to save the file. Give it a name. Headband. Save as. Select our mesh, but before we do export, what we want to do is go back into the UV editing workspace. That's our image that we created. What we need to do is make this real, i.e. we need to save it. So image, save as. That'll open up a pop-up where we need to save the file, headband, that's okay. Select the format that you want. A lossless is preferable, but in this case we can stick with PNG. and just save. This will create the image from the generated data that Blender itself creates. So this is now an image that can be imported into Studio, because if we export this without doing this step, Studio won't necessarily import the project. So now we can export. So layout, make sure our mesh is selected, and then click the export button. That creates our file, so it confirms that message at the bottom, and then we can import this into Studio. So in Studio, create a new project, so click the create button or the plus button at the top here, either or. Browse to our base product that we're going to derive from, so we want men, accessories, and then empty male accessory. So men, accessories, and then empty male. That'll give us a preview, and then click derive. This opens the base avatar. However, that's set. Then we need to import. So import button, import FBX, browse to the location of the file that was saved, and the toolkit prepends attachment or the tool category to the export to distinguish between the different tools that are available. So if this was a room, it would be room. If it was clothing, it would be clothing. Attachment, toolkit, open. We'll get the import dialog, so this is a preview of what's been found. Setup FBX. So here, we shouldn't need to change this, so that's the skeleton. We don't need to change any scaling. There's our mesh. There's the mesh ID, and we can set that for an accessory, for a male accessory to 0. If it was a female accessory, it would be 2. And then click next. Headband, there's the material. Next. No animation. Review. So that's what it's going to bring in. Import. And there is our headband. And of course, all we need to do next is go into component and edit the material that's assigned, so we can change the image if we wanted. Let's just use that one for now. Preview. It's a bit smushed because of the scale difference, so this is a square image as opposed to the very thin lozenge. We can assign opacity. Let's just use any old image that we've got. But this would be your proper opacity map. Let's assign a normal map. Let's just again use any old normal map that we've got. This might look very odd if the effect is visible at all. Shininess. Let's use one of these. Again, it'll be resized so we can see how shininess affects the mesh. And then of course, if you want emission, let's use a different image for that. Got to be grayscale. Let's try that one. Then enable the effect. This is going to be very bright. There is our glowy headband. And of course, once we're done editing the material, in the Info tab, so set the icons, change the name, any other properties profit, save the project, and then submit. So with accessories, back in Blender, all we need to do is make sure that we mesh the object where it needs to be. So it could be an armband, a wristband, a watch, a belt. So long as we select or set the correct bone, the corresponding bone, so that would be bicep for this, possibly wrist for these, or hand. And for a belt would be tricky. You would have to use a clothing file because it's likely that you would need to use spine, pelvis and hip bones so that the belt deforms. But that we'll cover in a separate video. But that's the basics. Using the toolkit and Blender to make a very simple headband, exported using the toolkit's attachment tool and then imported into Studio.